I was 29 years old the morning Dale Vorn stepped onto the Oreth convocation platform and did not bow. There were 11 of us in the diplomatic witness corridor that day: cultural attachés, protocol officers, a senior liaison I had never seen eat or sleep, and 2 translation clerks who had spent the previous night going over the Vel Oreth's third-tier ceremonial passages for the 47th time since they'd been assigned to the detail. The corridor was narrow, paneled in the Oreth's preferred stone, pale ashwood-colored mineral with veins of something darker running through it, a material they used for spaces where hierarchy was declared and recorded. The ceiling was low for the Oreth, who averaged a full head taller than any human present, and the viewing apertures were slotted at eye level for them, not for us. We stood on raised platforms the Oreth had provided as a formal courtesy, a condescension dressed as accommodation. I remember the platform edge digging slightly into my heel through my dress shoes, and thinking that the Oreth had probably calibrated it precisely to keep us just uncomfortable enough to remember where we stood. Dale Vorn did not stand on his platform. He was the only human on the convocation floor itself, which is what the ceremony required. He had been escorted in from the preparation chamber at the 9th bell of the Oreth morning cycle, their equivalent of early to mid-morning, when the ceremony had the most theological weight, and he had walked across 40 meters of resonance-cut stone floor to the center mark without any visible awareness of how many Oreth dignitaries were watching from the gallery above. The gallery ran the full circumference of the hall, 3 tiers of it, and every tier was full. The matriarch's senior household, the Dominion Council, the chain law adjudicators in their pale ceremonial shoulder wrappings, the archive witnesses, 8 of them, who had never before watched a ceremony involving a hollow species and looked at Dale Vorn the way you might look at something that had been brought into a room to illustrate a lesson. He was 44 years old that morning, lean in the way of someone who doesn't eat much when he's working, with close-cropped gray at his temples that he hadn't had when he was assigned to the detail 3 years prior. He wore the dress uniform of Earth's diplomatic division, dark blue, pressed to a standard that would have satisfied any military inspection, with the pale gold stitching at the collar that indicated a senior specialist. No medals, no rank insignia beyond the collar mark. The Oreth used visible markers of achievement the way other civilizations use currencies, accumulated, displayed, constantly read. He had been briefed on this. The absence of markers was not an oversight. The matriarch was already on the dais when he entered. She was what the Oreth call Veth Prime, the highest category in the chain, a bloodline that the Vel Oreth traces back through 11,000 years of recorded Dominion history, to the first unmarked who chose to become bound. The theology of this is layered and internally consistent in the way of systems that have been argued over for millennia and have arrived at a kind of terrible coherence. The short version, as I understood it from 2 years of preparation briefings, is this: the Oreth believed that all sapient life in the galaxy was seeded by the first beings, who existed before the chain. These first beings, the unmarked, in the oldest register of the Vel Oreth, passed on biological and spiritual inheritance when they chose to bind themselves to the emerging chain. Every bound family can trace its lineage back to an unmarked ancestor. Every species that the Oreth have encountered and classified as hollow cannot. The hollow have no lineage that connects to the chain. They are, in Oreth theology, lateral evolution, parallel, not descended. You can trade with the hollow, you can negotiate with them. You can absorb them into the chain through formal marriage to a bound family, at which point their biological line is legally reclassified as a tributary branch of the absorbing family's lineage. Their people receive formal protections. Their world receives a recognized place in the chain's hierarchy. What they do not receive, and never will receive under the standard framework, is independence. The tributary branch is a branch. It grows where the parent house allows it to grow. It does not set its own direction. This is what the matriarch believed she was doing when she accepted the peace proposal. I had read the pre-contact assessments, before I joined the liaison office. They were candid documents, written by people who had spent years studying the Orath and who were not in the habit of softening their conclusions. The assessment said, "The Orath do not operate in bad faith within their own framework. The chain law is not a tool they cynically deploy. They believe it. The Vel Orath is, for the Dominion, not merely legal code, it is cosmological fact. The chain exists. The lineages are real. The unmarked are the proof of a universe that was seeded with intention." A Veth Prime matriarch offering a peace marriage to a hollow species is, from inside that framework, an act of genuine generosity. She is offering them a place in the structure of the universe itself. That she also receives legal subordination of an entire species in exchange is not, to her, cynicism. It is the natural order being correctly arranged. Understanding this was, the assessments noted, essential to understanding why standard diplomatic pressure would not work. The Orath could not be argued out of the chain. They could not be threatened into abandoning it. What could be done? And this was where the assessments became very careful, very precise, and very specific about what they were and were not claiming, was to work within the chain in ways that its authors had not anticipated. The Orath had returned to this system 43 days earlier. Their fleet, 9 vessels of the Dominion Survey class, with the matriarch's personal convocation ship at the center, had emerged from transit at the outer marker and immediately begun transmitting on every frequency that the Orath used for territorial broadcast. The Vel Orath's 6th Register Sovereignty Declaration, repeated at 12-second intervals, layered over a navigation suppression signal that the Vel Orath technically defined as a courtesy to incoming traffic, and that everyone on Earth's watch platforms understood as something considerably less courteous. They had not been here in 90,000 years. Their own departure records, which we had held in archive for 80 years, obtained through channels I was not senior enough at the time to be told about, listed this system as resonance silent, as of the departure cycle that closed out the Orath's prior expansion period. Resonance silent was their classification for a world where the chain had determined there was nothing of theological consequence to preserve. A world whose inhabitants, if any, had no chain ancestry and no recoverable status. They had come back expecting to find us diminished, or gone, or exactly as small as they remembered. What they found instead, on the day their fleet arrived at the outer marker, was this: a planetary defense grid that was not there when they left. Orbital platforms, 11 of them, carrying weapon systems that the Orath's initial sensor sweeps identified as capable of engaging capital-class vessels in atmosphere. A communication network that answered on their own frequencies before they had finished their sovereignty broadcast. A diplomatic division that responded to their chain classification inquiry by citing the Vel Orath's own chapter and paragraph numbers. And then 2 weeks later, a station visit. The Orath had offered the use of their convocation ship as the venue for all proceedings. This was standard. The convocation ship was the matriarch's mobile court, the space where chain law questions were formally resolved, and by hosting negotiations there, the Orath were communicating in the clearest possible architectural language that this was their jurisdiction, their framework, their ground rules. Director Vorn had accepted the invitation without comment in 9th Register, which the Orath's protocol staff had flagged as indicating a level of preparedness that no prior first contact species had demonstrated. I boarded the convocation ship for the first time 10 days before the ceremony. The transfer shuttle was human-built. The liaison office had its own craft by that point, and I remember the moment of crossing from our airlock seal into the Orath corridor as one of the more disorienting transitions I had experienced in 2 years of diplomatic work. The scale was different. Not dramatically, the Orath are taller, not enormously so, and their architecture reflects this in ceiling heights and doorframe dimensions that feel subtly oversized rather than alien in any fundamental sense. But the material language of the space was entirely different from anything built by humans. The pale ashwood stone was everywhere. The lighting came from recess strips that ran along the joins between wall panels and floor, throwing a warm directional glow that illuminated surfaces cleanly, but left the middles of spaces in a soft half-shadow. The Orath see well in low-contrast light. The aesthetic effect, for human eyes, was a persistent sense that the rooms were larger than they appeared, and that important things were happening at the edges. The smell was the most striking thing. The Orath use a mineral compound in their construction material, the same dark-veined stone that produces in enclosed spaces at their preferred temperature an odor that I can only describe as cold copper with a faint organic undertone, something between forge work and rain on dry earth. It is not unpleasant. It is not pleasant. It is simply very much there, and after 4 days on the station, I had stopped noticing it. And then on the morning of the ceremony, I noticed it again, and it seemed to me like the smell of something about to be decided. The convocation hall was at the center of the ship. The approach corridor was 50 meters long, lined on both sides with the chain record carvings that Orath halls of formal proceeding always carry. 11,000 years of precedent rendered in the Vel Orath's formal notation, cut into the ashwood stone at a depth that made the individual characters readable only if you were standing close. I had walked that corridor 4 times in preparation visits. On the morning of the ceremony, I read several of the passages as I walked. My 9th register was not good enough to parse them at walking speed, but I recognized the structure, case records, rulings, the formal notation of precedent. The walls were not decoration. They were the accumulated weight of everything the Orath had decided over 11,000 years about how power worked and how the chain maintained itself. You were meant to feel that weight as you walked toward the hall. I felt it. What they found was the Orath arrival broadcast answered, within 6 minutes, by Earth's diplomatic division in 9th Register High Orath, the formal register of the Vel Orath that the Orath chain law adjudicators use for inter-house dispute resolution, a register so rarely used by non-Orath that the first response from the convocation ship was a 17-second silence before any transmission came back. 17 seconds is a long time to sit quiet when you have just broadcast a sovereignty declaration and expected either silence or low-register complaint. The return broadcast was from Director Ella Vorn, Dale's superior, and the head of the Earth-Orath Liaison Office, which had existed in one form or another for 81 years and had 17 staff. She had transmitted in 9th Register High Orath, formally and without error, to greet the Dominion Survey Fleet and note that the Earth Diplomatic Division had been expecting this contact for some time and had prepared accordingly. The Orath's initial response to this was to transmit a chain classification inquiry, a formal request, in 7th Register, for Earth to submit its lineage documentation so that the Dominion Council could assign an appropriate tributary status before negotiations began. Director Vorn had transmitted back in 9th Register, with formal Vel Orath citation marks, to note that Earth had submitted no lineage documentation, because Earth had not yet determined whether any lineage documentation applied and would like to discuss the relevant passages of the Vel Orath's 3rd volume, Chapter 42, before proceeding. The silence after that one was 23 seconds. Chapter 42 of the Vel Orath's 3rd volume is where the clause is written, the clause about continuous remembrance, the clause about the unmarked. I had not been on the liaison office staff when the first contact exchanges happened. I came in 18 months later, brought over from the standard diplomatic corps after the liaison office expanded quickly and needed people who could learn Orath formal registers under sustained working conditions. My Orath was strong enough to read primary sources. I had passed the registration test for the 7th Register. The 9 register fluency that Director Vorn and Dale Vorn demonstrated was something else entirely. Years of specialized study that most human linguists never attempted, because the theological framework the Vel Orath was written inside required you to understand the theology first, and the theology was not designed to be accessible from outside. It was Dale who had mapped the theology into something teachable for non-specialists. He had spent 11 years on it before the Orath arrived. He had been, before all of this, an academic, a historian of pre-departure interstellar civilizations, one of a small group of researchers who worked on the handful of alien civilizations that had made brief contact with Earth's outer system before pulling back. Most of them worked on species that had never returned. Dale had worked on the Orath. He had the departure records, and he had done something that the Orath had not expected anyone to do. He had read them as the Vel Orath reads things, which is to say theologically, not as survey data, not as historical record, as chain law. He had read 90,000-year-old records from a civilization he had never met and found, in the structure of their notation, a legal status that those records accidentally confirmed. This is what I mean when I say that the preparation was not recent. Dale Vorn had submitted his first theoretical paper on the continuous remembrance clause to the division's academic review committee 19 years before the Orath arrived. It was titled, in the dry way of academic papers that are also, in retrospect, strategic documents of great consequence, on the application of chain-adjacent resonance standards to non-contact preservation archives. The review committee had classified it as speculative methodology, which is the academic equivalent of filing something in a drawer and closing the drawer firmly, but the division had kept it. Someone in the division's research archive had kept it, and when the departure records came in and the liaison office was established, that paper was one of the first things put in front of the small team tasked with figuring out what options existed. Dale had been brought in as a consultant. He had become a staff specialist. He had eventually become the specialist, the one person in the liaison office whose knowledge of the Vel Orath was comprehensive enough to function not just as a reader of the text, but as an interpreter of the system that the text described. The Vel Orath is not a book you understand by reading it carefully. It is a book you understand by understanding the people who wrote it and the world they were writing to preserve. You have to understand what the Orath needed their law to do before you can understand what the law says. He had understood this from the beginning. That was his edge. The departure records listed this system's inhabitants, a pre-spaceflight civilization at the time of the Orath's last visit, as hollow. No chain lineage, no resonance signature. Standard tributary classification pending absorption upon next contact cycle. This was routine. The Orath had done it thousands of times. What the departure records also noted, in a subordinate clause that existed in the Vel Orath's recording, standard as a mandatory archival marker, rather than as anything anyone was expected to argue over, was the departure timestamp and the reason for delayed return. The system had been marked for standard contact at the next expansion cycle. The expansion cycle was delayed by internal Dominion reorganization. The return had not happened. The Vel Orath's third volume, Chapter 42, Paragraph 19, contains the following provision, which I had memorized in original High Orath, and which Dale had been the first human being to ever parse in its full legal context. A hollow species that maintains unbroken institutional memory of a bound or unmarked civilization across the period of that civilization's absence, meaning that the hollow species demonstrates they remembered, they recorded, they preserved the record and passed it forward through time, is no longer classifiable as hollow under the standard tributary framework. The preservation of the memory is, in the Vel Orath's own language, a form of chain-adjacent resonance. It does not make the species bound, but it removes them from hollow classification. And without hollow classification, the peace marriage absorption could not proceed. The matriarch had proposed the peace marriage herself, 6 weeks after contact. It was a standard dominion mechanism for concluding negotiations with species that the Orath intended to absorb formally, a respectful version of annexation, in their framework. A male of the other species would wed into a bound house. The male's biological line would be reclassified as a tributary branch of that house's lineage, and the male's originating species would receive the formal protections of the chain as a classified hollow tributary people. Trade rights, non-interference guarantees, the nominal dignity of having a recognized place in the chain. It was, when you read it from outside Orath theology, a mechanism for converting independent peoples into permanent legal subordinates of the Dominion's highest families. The protections were real. The constraints were also real. A hollow tributary people does not conduct external diplomacy independent of its absorbing house. A hollow tributary people does not expand its territory beyond the limits set by the absorbing house's assessment of what it can support. A hollow tributary people has legal standing in the chain, which is more than most hollow species get, and which comes at the price of every significant decision about their future being made by a Veth Prime household 11,000 light-years away. Director Vorn had accepted. The acceptance had been transmitted in 9th Register, with formal acknowledgement of the matriarch's house lineage designation and the standard Vel Orath pre-ceremony documentation request. The Orath had been, according to the analysts who reviewed those exchanges later, visibly surprised that Earth had responded with the correct pre-ceremony forms at all. The pre-ceremony forms are documented in the Vel Orath's 5th volume. Most species the Orath contacted didn't know the Vel Orath existed, let alone its 5th volume. The candidate submission had gone in 4 days after the acceptance. Dale Vorn, Senior Specialist, Earth Diplomatic Division, Orath Liaison Office, age 44. Family lineage documentation attached, running back 212 years through verified municipal records, the maximum the division had been able to compile in the time available. Chain classification documentation, submitted as pending further review per Vel Orath Vol. 3 ch. 42 para. 19. The Orath chain law adjudicators had formally noted that the paragraph citation was recognized, and that the Dominion Council would review the classification question before the ceremony. They had reviewed it for 3 weeks. They had not resolved it. The Vel Orath did not contain a mechanism for resolving a classification dispute in the absence of a formal challenge, and no formal challenge had been filed. The ceremony date arrived with the question technically unresolved. In the week before the ceremony, the liaison office ran 3 full-day briefing sessions for the witness team. I sat through all of them. The sessions were held in a converted meeting room on the lower level of Earth's temporary diplomatic compound on the Orath station, a compact space that smelled of recycled air and the faint mineral sharpness of the station's atmosphere processing, which the Orath ran slightly richer in certain trace compounds than any human environmental standard would have chosen. We had been told this was not deliberate. I was not the only one in the room who had noted that not deliberate is not the same as not convenient. Dale ran the sessions himself. He was not a natural presenter. He did not have the smooth cadence of the diplomats I had come from in the Standard Corps, who had been trained to hold a room's attention and to make complex information feel accessible. What he had instead was precision. When he spoke about the Vel Orath, he spoke about it the way someone speaks about a place they have lived, with the familiarity of long habitation and the occasional assumption that his listeners shared a geography they did not actually share. He caught himself doing this and would back up, restate, add context, but the underlying relationship to the material was always clear. He was not explaining a foreign thing. He was explaining his home, which happened to be a foreign thing. On the first day, he covered the chain. Not the parts of it that were relevant to the ceremony, all of it. The full framework, from the theology of the unmarked through the structure of bound lineages and tributary systems, to the procedural law of the Vel-Orath's ceremonial volumes. He wanted us to understand the chain the way the Orath understood it, which meant understanding that it was not a legal system that also happened to have theological underpinnings. It was a theology that had expressed itself over 11,000 years in the form of law. The law was the theology made operational. If you read the Vel-Orath as purely a legal document, you would misread it. If you read it as purely a religious text, you would also misread it. It existed in the seam between those categories, and it only made sense inside that seam. On the second day, he covered the ceremony itself, its structure, its sequence, its chain law weight. He walked us through every stage, from the candidate's entry acknowledgement through the lineage declaration to the absorption confirmation. He noted each stage's theological meaning, which register it operated in, and what the formal record would show if any stage was altered, suspended, or performed incorrectly. He did this with the completeness of someone who had spent years imagining every possible variation, and wanted to ensure that the people in the room could follow what they were going to see. He did not, in either of those 2 days, tell us what he intended to do. On the third day, 2 days before the ceremony, he told us. He told us about paragraph 19 and provision 7. He told us about the archive and the continuous remembrance argument. He told us about volume 5, chapter 12, and what the suspension would legally accomplish. He was precise and organized, and when he finished, he paused and looked around the room and said, "The chain of reasoning is sound. Every step has been reviewed by the division's legal team and by 3 independent Orath law scholars at 2 different universities. The argument is not speculative. It is the Vel-Orath, read carefully." Then he said, "But I want to be clear about something. We are asking the Orath's own law to protect us from the Orath. This is not a trick. This is not a deception. Every word I will speak on the convocation floor will be accurate and citable. The archive exists. The continuous remembrance claim is real. The provisions I will invoke are real provisions. What we are doing is what humans have always done when they are smaller than the thing they are facing. We read the room more carefully than the room read us." Someone in the briefing, one of the translation clerks, a woman named Sira who had been on the Orath detail for 6 years and who was not easily impressed, said, "And if the adjudicators simply refuse to follow their own law?" Dale had said, "Then we document the refusal. We appeal to the council under the Vel-Orath's internal consistency provisions, and we make the Dominion choose between following their own law and violating it publicly in a record that will sit in their own archive for the remainder of the Dominion's existence. The Orath's law is their theology. Publicly violating it is not something a Veth Prime matriarch does lightly." The translation clerk had nodded slowly and written something in her notes. I remember thinking that evening, sitting in the compound's common space and looking out through the viewing port at Earth hanging in the distance, still large enough to fill a portion of the port, the orbital platforms visible in the near distance as small bright points, that the whole machinery of it had been built over a very long time by a very large number of people. The departure records obtained 80 years ago by someone whose name I did not know, through channels I was not told about. The academic work that had filled the intervening decades. The identification of Dale's paper in the archive, and whoever had made the decision to bring him in. The 81 years of institutional preservation that gave the continuous remembrance argument its foundation. The 17 other approaches sitting in reserve in the director's office, unused. It did not feel like the work of a single person or a single generation. It felt like the kind of thing that gets built when a people decides, quietly and collectively, and without the luxury of knowing when the work will pay off, to take the long preparation seriously, not because they were certain it would succeed, because they had the time and they intended to use it, and because the Orath, when they eventually came back, would be reading whatever humanity had done with those 90,000 years as a statement of what kind of people we were. We had made the statement. I did not know, until much later, whether this was Dale's intent from the beginning. I had been briefed enough to understand the outline, that the classification question mattered, that the ceremony would be the moment of resolution, but I did not have the chain law fluency to fully follow what was happening in real time. I was in the witness corridor to observe and to record. I had a translation earpiece running the 7th register feed. I watched Dale walk to the center mark and stand there, and I watched the matriarch on the dais above him, and I tried to read the ceremony the way I'd been trained to read Orath formal gatherings, as a chain of status declarations, each gesture and posture carrying a weight that the Vel Orath had encoded over 11,000 years of practice. He had not bowed. The Orath bow when entering a convocation space is a 7th register acknowledgement of the senior bound presence in the room, a chain hierarchy recognition that is mandatory for all hollow and hollow tributary individuals. It is not optional. There is no version of Orath ceremony in which a hollow person enters a convocation space and does not bow. The gallery had gone still the moment he didn't. The matriarch's posture had not changed. The chain law adjudicators in the front tier of the gallery had gone very still in the specific way that Orath go still when they are looking at something they do not have a category for. I had seen it once before, in training footage from the first weeks of contact, when Director Vorn had transmitted in 9th register, and the convocation ship had gone 17 seconds quiet. It is not confusion exactly. It is the Orath equivalent of an experienced professional encountering a situation their training did not anticipate. The senior chain law adjudicator, an elder of the matriarch's household, an Orath with visible long service markings on both shoulder ridges and the deep ochre tone of a high-bound bloodline, had risen from his seat and transmitted the formal inquiry at full ceremonial volume, which in the convocation hall means the walls carry it. Why does the candidate not perform the entry acknowledgement? Dale had answered in 9th register. My translation earpiece gave me the words. My knowledge of chain law gave me approximately 60% of the context. The full context I got from the transcript later, compiled by Director Vorn's office. He said, he does not perform the entry acknowledgement because his classification has not been resolved, and the entry acknowledgement is mandatory only for those whose classification is confirmed. He is present as a candidate under review, and the review is unresolved. He invokes Vel Orath, Volume 3, Chapter 42, Paragraph 19, Provision 7. In the absence of confirmed classification, a candidate under active review may not be required to perform any acknowledgement that presupposes a classification outcome. Provision 7. I had known about Paragraph 19. I had not known about Provision 7. Looking at the gallery after he spoke, I do not think most of the adjudicators had thought about Provision 7 recently either. It is a minor procedural clause inside a chapter that documents an extremely rare scenario. It had not been invoked in Orath ceremonial history in over 4,000 years. The senior adjudicator had asked him, in a register I clocked as 8th, slightly less formal, slightly more direct, on what basis he was claiming the continuous remembrance provision of Paragraph 19 applied to him. Dale had said, the basis is the Earth Orath Liaison Office Archive, which contains complete copies of the Orath survey departure records for this system from the cycle 90,000 years prior, maintained continuously and in institutional custody for 81 years, preceded by decentralized scholarly preservation for an additional 40 years, with full provenance documentation available for review. The archive demonstrates unbroken institutional memory of the Orath Dominion across the period of the Dominion's absence from this system. Under Paragraph 19, this constitutes chain-adjacent resonance and removes the candidate's species from standard hollow classification. He had therefore not entered as hollow. He had entered as unclassified. The gallery made a sound I had never heard before from any Oreth gathering. I do not have a good word for it. It was not speech. It was the sound that comes from 3 tiers of highly trained specialists in a specialized legal theological system, simultaneously encountering something that their system had never actually had to process. An intake, a suspended moment. The kind of sound a room makes when everyone in it is reaching for the same passage in their memory at the same moment, and not quite finding it where they expected it. The matriarch spoke for the first time since Dale had entered. She spoke in 10th register, which is above 9th, the register used for formal chain adjudication by the highest bound lineages when the question before them is one of theological first-order consequence. My translation earpiece does not carry 10th register. I read the transcript. She said, "The claim is noted." She asked the senior adjudicator to confirm whether the provenance documentation could be verified in the current session. The senior adjudicator had said, it could not in the current session. Verification of a continuous remembrance claim under paragraph 19 required review by a minimum of 3 chain law archivists with access to both the claimant's documentation and the original Oreth departure records for cross-comparison. The Dominion Council had not assembled that panel. The panel would take, at minimum, 14 days to convene. The matriarch had been quiet for a moment that the transcript notes as approximately 9 seconds. Then she had asked the adjudicator, in 10th register, whether the ceremony could proceed while the classification was unresolved. The adjudicator had said, it could not. The absorption through marriage mechanism of the peace marriage ceremony is only valid when the candidate's hollow status is confirmed. If the candidate is not classified as hollow, the ceremony has no legal theological mechanism for proceeding. To conduct a peace marriage ceremony with an unclassified candidate would be to perform a chain binding with unknown lineage status, which the Vel Oreth explicitly prohibits. The ceremony cannot establish what it is not permitted to assume. 9 seconds. In the transcript it just says pause, but I remember the silence from the corridor. I remember the way the gallery had gone from that suspended intake sound to total quiet, and how total quiet in a room with that many Oreth in it felt different from quiet in any other context I had experienced. The Oreth are not a quiet people. Their formal registers are precise, but their silences are expressive, and that silence was not neutral. The matriarch had asked, in 10th register, whether the ceremony could be rescheduled pending resolution of the classification review. The adjudicator had said, it could, but rescheduling after the candidate's arrival on the convocation platform created a formal precedent. Per the Vel Oreth's 5th volume, a ceremony that has begun and been suspended without completion is recorded in the chain's ceremonial archive as a suspended ceremony. This is distinct from a ceremony that was never scheduled. A suspended ceremony involving an unclassified candidate, per Volume 5, Chapter 12, creates an automatic preservation hold on the candidate's status. The candidate cannot be reclassified by unilateral dominion action while the ceremony is suspended, because the suspension itself creates a pending review protection under chain law. Another silence, longer. The matriarch had looked at Dale Vorn standing on the convocation floor. He was standing the way he always stood when I had seen him in briefing rooms, slightly at ease, hands still, looking at the person he was speaking to without any visible indication that the conversation was anything other than routine. I had thought before that morning that this was simply his temperament, a certain quality of stillness that some people have. I understood it differently watching him on the convocation floor. He had come into a room designed to make him acknowledge his own smallness, and he had declined to do so, not by defiance, not by confrontation, but by the precise and careful exercise of the room's own rules, which he knew better than most of the people in the gallery. Every Oreth in the gallery had spent their professional lives inside the Vel Oreth. Dale had spent 11 years approaching it from outside, which meant he had read it the way you read a thing you are trying to understand rather than a thing you already live in. He had found the load-bearing passages. The matriarch spoke once more, in a register that my earpiece gave me as 7th, a step down from the 10th register formality she had been using, a register that felt, to those of us in the witness corridor, like a drop in temperature. She said, "The ceremony is suspended." She said, "The classification review will be convened in 14 days." She said, "The candidate will be accorded full convocation guest status during the review period, with all protections that status carries under chain law." And then she said one more thing that was not in the formal registers at all. The adjudicator later noted it in the record as an off-register personal address, which is exceedingly rare from a Veth Prime. The transcript reads it as, "She asked Dale Vorn directly whether he had known this would happen. He had said, 'I knew the Vel Orath. I knew what it said. I did not know what you would do with it.'" She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had turned and left the dais. The gallery emptied in a sequence that the protocol officers on my platform identified as highly unusual. Not the standard departure order, which follows chain rank, but something closer to people leaving when they were ready to leave, as if the ordinary choreography of hierarchy had been briefly suspended by the need to process what had just happened. The adjudicators left last, in a cluster, speaking to each other in a register too low for my earpiece to carry. I went down to the convocation floor afterward, once the Orath had cleared and the translation clerks had confirmed the floor was open for diplomatic staff. Dale was still at the center mark. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing, the way he'd been standing the whole time, with the same quality of stillness that I now understood was not indifference but something much more like certainty. I asked him, because I was 29 years old and had been awake for 31 hours, and was running on adrenaline and very bad Orheth coffee, whether he had been afraid. He said yes. I asked him at what point. He said, from the moment the matriarch accepted the candidate's submission. Because the submission worked the way it was designed to work only if the Dominion Council's adjudicators had either not thought carefully enough about paragraph 19, or had thought about it, and decided the risk of raising it before the ceremony was greater than the risk of letting it surface at the ceremony. If they had raised it before, if they had said, 3 weeks ago, this candidate is invoking continuous remembrance, this claim must be resolved before we proceed, the ceremony would have been delayed and humanity would have had to find another approach. The gamble was that the adjudicators, faced with a claim they had never seen before from a species they had classified as hollow, would do what institutions do when they encounter something unprecedented. Note it, flag it, put it in a pending column, and proceed with what they knew. Let the ceremony proceed and resolve the question afterward. I said, and that's what they did. He said, that's what they did. I asked him whether it would have worked if they hadn't, whether there was a fallback. He was quiet for a moment. He said, there were 17 other approaches that the director's office had developed over the previous 3 years. Some of them were better, some of them were longer. All of them required the Orath to make a mistake or to concede something they would not willingly concede. This one only required them to follow their own law. I had been briefed enough to ask the next question. I said, and the classification review, will they confirm the continuous remembrance claim? He said, probably not in a strict reading. The archive is 81 years of institutional records. Paragraph 19 standard interpretation requires a longer chain of demonstrable preservation. Most precedents cite multiple centuries. Our scholars will argue for a broader interpretation based on the density and precision of the documentation. The Orath adjudicators will argue for strict construction. The review will probably take longer than 14 days. I said, so the suspension holds. He said, yes. And while it holds under Volume 5, Chapter 12, humanity's classification status cannot be altered by unilateral dominion action. The ORETH cannot reclassify us as standard hollow while a pending review protection is active. They can resolve the classification question, either by confirming the continuous remembrance claim, which gives us a non-hollow status, or by denying it, which puts us back into a hollow classification. But the denial would itself be subject to appeal under chain law, and the appeal process has its own preservation clauses. The ORETH have very good law. They built it over 11,000 years to protect the complexity of the chain. I understood then what I was looking at. The archive, the 81 years of scholarship, the chain law study and the 9th register fluency, and the 11 years Dale had spent turning the departure records into a legal argument. The selection process that had placed him specifically here, specifically in this role. Not because he was the most decorated or the most senior. Because he was the one human being who had spent more of his adult life inside the Vel ORETH than outside it. Who had read it as a foreign text until he understood it as a native one. And who had found in the seams of that 11,000-year structure the one small clause that an 11,000-year-old institution had written without imagining that anyone outside the chain would ever be positioned to use it. The ORETH had come back expecting to find something manageable, something classifiable, something they had a mechanism for. Earth had spent 80 years becoming the thing they didn't have a mechanism for. Not through force, not through threats, not through the fleet sitting in high orbit with its weapons live, which is also there, which any analysis of Earth's current defense posture makes very clear is also there. Through the Vel ORETH. Through the law the ORETH themselves had built. I asked him how it ends. He said, I don't know, these things take a long time. He said, but that's all right, we're good at long. The classification review took 4 years. I was assigned to the liaison office for 2 of them, and then rotated back to the Standard Corps. I followed the review through the division's public summaries. The ORETH adjudicators appointed 3 successive panels. The first panel deadlocked. The second panel produced a minority opinion that supported a modified continuous remembrance standard. And the third panel produced a ruling that the standard interpretation of paragraph 19 required a minimum of 300 years of documented institutional preservation, rather than 81 years, and that therefore the claim was denied under strict construction. Earth's chain law scholars appealed immediately, citing the minority opinion from the second panel and 3 precedents from ORETH internal case law that the third panel had not addressed. The appeal was accepted by the Dominion Council's appellate body in year 3 of the review and is currently pending a 4th panel review, which the Vel ORETH's appellate procedures require to include at least 1 adjudicator with no prior involvement in the case. During the appeal, Volume 5, Chapter 12 still applies. Dale Vorn is still on convocation guest status. He is, to my knowledge, the only human being in ORETH history to have held that status for more than 6 months. He has, by all accounts, used the time productively. Convocation guest status includes unrestricted access to the Dominion's open archive libraries. A courtesy extended because the Vel ORETH requires that guests in good standing not be impeded from the resources needed to prepare their case. The open archive libraries of the ORETH Dominion contain the chain law precedent record going back 11,000 years. Every case, every ruling, every minority opinion, every procedural appeal. Our scholars, working with materials that Dale has been transmitting to the liaison office for the past 4 years, have now identified 231 clauses in the Vel ORETH that may be relevant to humanity's classification proceedings, directly or indirectly. 47 of those clauses have never been invoked by a non-ORETH party. 19 of them, according to the legal team's current assessment, could support arguments that would extend the preservation hold if the 4th panel rules against us. I ran into Director Vorn at a division function 18 months after my rotation back. I asked her whether she had known, when she accepted the matriarch's proposal, that Dale's approach would work. She said, "We knew what the Vel Oreth said. We knew what our archive contained. We knew the procedural argument was sound under any reasonable reading of Volume 5, Chapter 12. We did not know what the Oreth would do, whether they would table the classification question before the ceremony, or resolve it by force, or find some mechanism we hadn't anticipated." I said, "So it was a gamble." She said, "Everything is a gamble. We tried to make ours a good one." I said, "Was it?" She looked at me the way senior people look at junior people, when the junior person has asked a question that the senior person finds slightly obvious. She said, "They proposed the peace marriage to absorb us into the chain as legal subordinates of their highest house. We are now the subject of a 4-year classification review that has occupied 3 adjudicator panels and is currently pending before the Dominion Council's appellate body. And the pending status means we have a chain law preservation hold on our classification that the Oreth cannot unilaterally dissolve. The matriarch cannot classify us, cannot trade us, cannot absorb us, and cannot reschedule a ceremony that is by chain law precedent considered initiated and suspended until the classification question is resolved. We have been under that protection for 4 years. When the appeal concludes, we will either have a non-hollow status or we will appeal again. Each appeal extends the preservation hold." She said, "We did not win the ceremony. We built something inside their law that will take them longer to remove than the classification question takes to resolve. And every year of that process is a year in which the Oreth adjudicators are reading our archive, comparing it to their own departure records, and encountering the documentation of 80 years of scholarship conducted by a species they came back expecting to absorb. The documentation is not an argument. It is a fact about what we did with the time they gave us." She paused. She said, "The Vel Oreth contains 11,000 years of chain law. There are, as near as our scholars can determine, somewhere between 800 and 1,200 clauses in it that have never been invoked by a non-Oreth party, either because no non-Oreth party knew about them, or because no non-Oreth party was positioned to use them. We have identified 89 of those clauses. We will not need all of them." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "How many do you think you'll need?" She thought about it. She said, "As many as it takes, and then one more than they expect." The last thing I want to record here, because I think it is the thing I will carry longest, is something I saw on the convocation floor that morning before I spoke to Dale. The gallery had cleared. The ceremony was officially suspended. The Oreth staff were moving through the hall in that particular way of people who have been given a task that helps them avoid having to be still. And in the corner of the gallery, nearest the exit archway, the senior chain law adjudicator, the elder with the long service markings on both shoulder ridges, who had been the one to formally note every procedural complication as it arose, had stopped moving. He was standing very still, looking at the convocation floor. I followed his eyeline. He was looking at the center mark where Dale had stood, just the empty floor, the pale ashwood stone with its dark veins. The place where a human being had stood without bowing, and answered every question asked of him in 9th Register, and invoked a provision that had not been invoked in 4,000 years, and then stood afterward with the quiet of someone who had done a difficult thing, and knew it was not over. The adjudicator stood there for a long time. Then he turned and walked out. I have thought about that moment many times since, about what he was reading in the empty floor, about what he had recognized that morning that he had not expected to recognize, about what it means to spend your career as a custodian of a law that was built to last forever, and to encounter, for the first time, a party who has read that law as carefully as you have. The Oreth came back to this system expecting to find what they remembered. They found something that had spent 90,000 years and more specifically, 81 of those years, becoming something the Vel Orath did not have a category for. Not stronger in the way they feared. Stronger in the way they had not anticipated needing to fear. We remembered them. We learned their law. We learned it well enough to live inside it. That is what we did with the time.